Notre invité aujourd'hui est le journaliste américain Seymour Hersh, prix Pulitzer en 1970. Il est connu pour avoir révélé de nombreux dysfonctionnements de l'armée américaine et de l'État américain. En particulier, c'est lui qui a révélé le terrible massacre de My Lai pendant la guerre du Viêt Nam et, bien des années plus tard, il a également révélé les exactions au sein de la prison d'Abou Ghraib en Irak. Il revient avec nous sur 50 ans de carrière et présente sa vision du journalisme. Seymour Hersh, bonjour. Votre premier livre portait sur la guerre chimique et biologique. Pourquoi aviez-vous choisi ce sujet et qu'avez-vous découvert lors de votre enquête?
About chemical warfare. This was I started writing this book in 1966. You know, when most of the people watching this weren't even born, I'm sure. One of the things that bothered me was the extent to which we were using very toxic chemicals and in populated areas of South Vietnam, and particularly in areas where we were just in '66, the war was going very big. We had, I think we were very close by then, even 500,000 American men in combat in this small country, causing enormous damage. One can't even begin to describe. At one point, the military, at some point, was it 1 million non-combatants killed? 2 million? We don't even know. It was just sort of a genocidal war. I think everybody agrees on that. And it was a little disturbing to see how much they were doing. They were American airplanes, Air Force planes were dropping these toxic chemicals that we now know, we've known for many years, now cause enormous horrible fetal problems in young babies. And I was taken on a trip. I was in Saigon maybe 5 years ago, and I was taken to the countryside where there was a lot of bombing towards the border with Cambodia from Saigon in Vietnam. I saw shown all sorts of young children with no legs, arms, et cetera, et cetera. The cause is obviously of the toxic chemicals. And the model of the pilots, the American pilots and crew members who flew the planes, the chemicals, was only we can destroy forests. Only we can destroy forests. It's amazing. So, you know, what we couldn't win in combat, we could maybe destroy. And of course, there was no differentiation between areas that were used by our enemy, the Viet Cong, the phrase we used for the Vietnamese. We call them Vietnamese communists, but most of the people in the opposition were nationalists, just didn't like the Americans. Anyway, the callousness was clear. I don't know whether the book I did may be more open to do the work I did on the Milan Massacre, but that book was published in '67, and through that, I began to get more involved in reading about the war. I had worked for the Associated Press in the Pentagon for 2 years, and I learned then, '65 and '66, I was reporting daily on the military, and of course, it was all about the war, the Vietnam War, which was expanding. And I was pretty jaded then. I eventually, I was not good for the Associated Press. They really that caused so much trouble with the powers that be in the Pentagon, Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and his people, that eventually they had to move me out of there. And eventually I quit because I knew I was being pushed out because of my views on the war. One of the things that I try to say to potential journalists is you can't write if you don't read. And so one of the problems we have is that so much journalism now is fly by the seat of the pants, not enough work done. But you know, anybody as old as I am, and as we always criticize the young, you know, they didn't do it the way we do it. But it is interesting to me how less thoughtful I think the media is these days in terms of the issues you care about, propaganda, et cetera, as we were talking earlier. Anyway, what I learned about the use of defoliants in Vietnam made me aware even more about what was going on in Vietnam, so that 2 years later, in 1969, in the fall of '69, Nixon had been elected president, and Kissinger was running, his national security advisor was running the war. and it wasn't going well. But I did learn that I got a tip about a massacre in South Vietnam. Later became a famous, maybe not so much now, but at the time, a very famous event, the My Lai massacre. My Lai was a village in the northern part of South Vietnam that had traditionally been very anti-French. The opposition, the Viet Minh, as we in America called the opposition to the French then, Viet Minh, and it was actually, of course, in the north too. People forget that your country, France, fought a war between 46 and 54, involving at the minimum maybe 500,000 soldiers, and maybe 80% of them French, the other 100,000 from some of your territories, your exploitive territories. But and you lost that war. You were driven off, and why America thought it could do better, I don't know, but we did. So we couldn't do better. We ended up not differentiating in Vietnam between the guerrillas, the Viet Cong, the opposition to us, the local opposition, and the citizenry. So there was just a lot of killing that wasn't necessary. As I started to say, the estimates were between 1 and 2 million Vietnamese non-combatants killed, as if there's not much difference between 1 million and 2 million. Just some sort of racist talk that was running around back then. Anyway, I just got a tip about something horrible happened in South Vietnam, and I just chased it. I believed it was possible. When I got the tip, it was I was in Washington working as a freelance writer. I was married with a kid, not making, doing all right. Back then, we paid, I think, $1 for 4 gallons of gasoline and 18 cents for a gallon of heating oil. I mean, you could live on not much money. Not anymore. Anyway, what struck me was what I initially thought when I heard that we had killed a lot of people in a terrible massacre. I thought maybe a bomb fell in the wrong place, which was, bombs never go where they're aimed. We learned that in World War II. We did learn that in World War II. They never go where they're aimed. God knows a lot of British and American bombs were aimed at German cities and German people, but we don't talk about that much. Anyway, and it turned out as I got into it, it wasn't that at all. It was just a group of boys went crazy with bad leadership, went into a village and murdered 500 people, raped most of the women. It was just a terrible show and was covered up. And it had happened a year and a half earlier. I learned about it in the fall, September of 1969. The event took place in March of 68. It was covered up by everybody. And so it just was, I was a freelance writer. I could do what I wanted. I didn't have an editor to tell me, no, you can't do it. As I had often at the AP, there was a lot of things I wanted to do I couldn't do. And so it was, I wouldn't say it was fun. As I did the story, I learned more and more. It wasn't about some bomb falling. It was about a bunch of uneducated, not poorly supervised GIs who, with contempt for the Vietnamese people for reasons I'm not clear. They told me later, some of the boys, they told me, well, they don't have refrigerators in their house, in their huts. And they had, they were a primitive society, and to the American view, it was a very, the amount of ignorance in the American war in Vietnam was stupendous. Just like, I think, in all wars. Seems to me that's the one denomination. Let's see, my country did what? We've done Afghanistan, we did Iraq. How did we do in those countries? Not so well. Anyway, no learning curve. So for me, it was traumatic because I didn't realize what really had happened. When I started the story, I didn't realize it was going to end up with me hearing about American GIs taking young babies and throwing them up and catching them on their bayonet and raping all. I didn't know that when I started. I guess I would have done the same thing if I had, but it was very... anyway, I wrote 2 books about it, and I got to work for the New Yorker magazine, which was a very wonderful, the high place to work for an American journalist. That was in 71, and by 72, the New York Times, with which I had not a good relationship, because I thought they were very snooty and they sold stories all the time. they offered me a job to sort of come and do whatever I want in Washington about the war. And the New York Times, then being a paper with much more prestige and power than it has today, because America, we can talk about journalism today, it's much different. Then the New York Times was seen as a straight paper by everybody, by the left, the right, those who supported the war and those who hated it. And so it was easy. It was a real challenge and very rewarding for me. I spent 8 years there writing an awful lot about the war, and eventually about the Watergate scandal and about the CIA and about what the CIA did in Chile and about secret boats that we built to collect Russian submarines. I had a lot of fun at the New York Times. It was a great place. But and then I went off. I did that for 8 years, and then I went off to write books, which are much more interesting. And I wrote a very interesting book about Henry Kissinger that called The Price of Power, a very critical book. And then I just wrote about other things. I wrote about the Israeli nuclear bomb and all sorts of other books, I think 11 or so. And they're all the same stuff. I just took a subject and just did what I wanted and wrote what I wanted and had very good editors. So I've had a very fine time. Right now, the virus has interrupted a project I was working on a year and a half ago because it's very hard. A documentary. I've done some film work too. I did 3 documentaries. And documentaries seem to be the way to go because I don't know what's happening in France, but more and more people aren't reading in America, it seems to me. We're watching. We watch these dumb shows on TV. It's very hard to work now because if you have to travel with a crew of cameramen and men for lighting and all that, the responsibility is enormous in terms of the potential for getting COVID, and the insurance costs are high. And America is still the Wild West when it comes to things like common sense, with 35% of the American people, or 30%, refusing to take a vaccine that could save their lives and the lives of their children. So that's where we are in America today. We've always been a divided country, though. We were divided in the Civil War. We were divided on the Viêt Nam War. When I wrote the My Lai story, I think the initial polls showed that more than 50% of the people who learned about My Lai thought it was okay. Why not kill the gooks? That's what we called it. We called the Vietnamese, the phrases, I don't know what phrases the French had. We called the Vietnamese slopes, whether for the broad face, I don't know why, gooks, dinks, just like we call when we're in the American boys in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, I don't know, hajis, they call hajis. Derogative terms comes from no education about who we're fighting and why we're fighting and what's going on. Our soldiers aren't particularly well trained in that stuff. So that's been my life. You know, why I chose to always write negatively about my country is I'll leave for others to figure out. I don't know why.
Pensez-vous aujourd'hui que les étudiants américains soient bien informés de ce massacre qui a été finalement un vrai ouragan sur glane vietnamien?
What planet are you living in? You think anybody today reads about history? Do you really do? Are you kidding? History, something that happened 50 years ago? No, I think there's some older people who might know. No, nobody knows. I mean, people in America, there's not much interest in the Vietnam War. First of all, we lost the war. That's not any good. And there's not much interest in the war in Iraq. And, you know, when the virus hit, 19 months ago, in March of 2020, I doubt when I was, I had done many speeches on the Vietnam War, but by 1975, 1970, we lost the war. That disappeared. Other issues came. And there's still some scholarship in America on the Vietnam War. And actually, I'm involved now in a project of going back to the Vietnam War, to the beginnings. I'm very interested in the French period, too. I'm going back from the very beginnings. And it's just, there was a period, I'd say, till 1980, when some universities taught Vietnam. There were courses on the war. But that doesn't happen anymore. The armies, the the military academy for the United States Army, West Point, the famous West Point, they've dropped their courses on Vietnam. Why not? We lost the war. You know, we got driven off by a bunch of people that, my God, in most of the villages, people didn't have refrigerators. Oh my God, how could we lose to them? You know, so it's sort of a primitive thought. No, I would say that 5% of the American people today have some idea about Vietnam, and even a lesser percentage have any idea about the massacre.
Est-ce que vous craignez que ce massacre tombe dans l'oubli?
I've done my job. I wrote a book about it, and then I wrote a book about how it's covered up. And I'm now actually doing something. I'm doing a documentary I was in the middle of it when the virus struck, that goes back into the early French, even before the war, before the French War. I go back to 1947 with there's a lot of new stuff that's come out about the war. And in terms of anti-communism, in terms of, I think the American support for the French war was much greater than anybody knows. I didn't know that. We always thought that Eisenhower didn't want to get involved in helping the French. That's not so. He did much more than people know. And they still, again, for me, the telling fact, as long as we're talking to somebody in Paris, is the French put all those people in over 8 years and could not win. What was America thinking about? Thinking we could go in? I mean, these are very tough customers. What were you thinking about? We could do what the French couldn't do? You know, I don't quite understand it.
Vous avez donc obtenu un prix Pulitzer pour votre reportage sur Mỹ Lai. Ensuite, vous avez travaillé au New York Times sur le Watergate, puis sur l'espionnage du mouvement pacifiste. Qu'avez-vous découvert à ce moment-là sur les opérations de la CIA en termes d'espionnage des citoyens américains?
Yes, and actually, it's very interesting. I wrote a story in 1974. I'd been at the Times for 2.5 years then. And I must say, I did things I don't think you could do today in terms of being free and being free to write such critical stories, because what I wrote about Mỹ Lai turned out to be true, and what the books I wrote, you know, and then I wrote a lot of stories about the CIA in Chile that after Allende, and that turned out to be so. And so with that kind of record, I learned in 72 that the CIA had been spying on Americans who were against the war. And at that time, there was oh my God, the CIA is supposed to, under the law, the Central Intelligence Agency in America was set up after World War II in 1947 as a foreign intelligence operation, and absolutely forbidden to do anything domestically. Any domestic investigations had to be done by the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, you know, the anti-communism of those days. And the anti-communism inside the CIA was just as acute, because many of the CIA operatives, that the initial ones that it began, worked in the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, worked with the anti-German, anti-Nazi elements throughout Europe and throughout Asia. But also there was enormous anti-communism too. There was a great spread in that. Was, you know, for many Americans after the war, was Nazism worse than communism, or was I mean, there was that issue anyway. But the bottom line is, they were barred from working inside America. And so the story I wrote simply said that the CIA had been working for 6 years by then, or 8 years. They started in 66 or 67, spying on anti-war students. President Johnson was very concerned that the anti-war attitude in America. I'm sorry, I left my phone on. I'm going to turn it off. Johnson was convinced that the only reason there was anti-war feelings in him about the Vietnam War was that the communists, the kids running it, were communists. It was really crazy stuff. So the agency got involved, and that was a big story, that they had been spying on Americans at that time for 7 years without anybody knowing. And I wrote that in December 1974 for the New York Times, and that was a big shock for a lot of people. And the Senate began a series of hearings. It's called the Church Committee, after the senator who led it, Frank Church of Idaho, a very progressive and very bright Democrat. And they had, I think, a year and a half of hearings that for the first time looked more or less deeply into the CIA. And they came out with a lot of recommendations that were eventually dissipated. They were watered down, and the CIA still operated as at will. I mean, as you know, secretly, covertly. What I found since then, and that I'm actually working on right now, is the extent to which, from the very beginning, from 1947, the CIA was working domestically in violation of its agreements, of its legal standing. I mean, how naive we all were, you know, that if the CIA was willing to spy on American students, which was a high-risk thing, imagine what else they were doing here that were more secret and easily protected. Anyway, I'm into that now.
Aujourd'hui, toutes les agences espionnent le monde entier. Quel rôle ont joué les États-Unis dans ce mouvement?
Well, right now it's a growth industry. I think the Israelis have been the leading edge of that. I don't know why that's so new. The Israelis are, you know, I deplore, as anybody should, the way the Israelis treat the Arab world, particularly the Palestinians and their own citizens. I'm not. And what's interesting to me, even though I don't have much hope for the new government, and now that Bibi Netanyahu is gone, it's as tough as any. Mr. Bennett is quite tough. It's interesting to me that in the last 5-6 years, the attitude towards many people in the world towards Israel has hardened on this issue. Although Israel, there's all this talk about a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East, and who knows, Israel has what? I wrote a book about it called The Samson Option once. It was published in 1991. I wrote a book, did a lot of research on basically the issue of the book was, my point in the book was, if Israel wants to build a bomb, okay, build a bomb. My book was all about the secret American support for the bomb, with every president from Jack Kennedy on, looking the other way. And so I was critical of that. And you know, as an American Jew, when the book was first published, the New York Times, my old newspaper, I had left the newspaper by then, they wrote a big story about the book. I had a lot to say about the American role in helping the Israelis get a bomb, which was quite absolutely wrong, absolutely in violation. And at one point, a leading American scientist went to Pakistan in 1977 when then he hadn't been killed yet, assassinated yet, Bhutto was prime minister, and went to him in 1977 because we knew Pakistan was getting involved in buying the equipment needed to build a reactor and get a bomb for itself, which they now have 2 reactors going anyway. And this scientist once told me 10 years later, an American scientist who worked for the government, but he also worked in teaching at Harvard University. He said, when I went to see Bhutto and I said, you can't do the bomb. And he said, tell it to the Israelis. You think you can get away with helping the Israelis build a bomb and you come to me now, your hands unclean. And for me, that's what made me decide to do the book, because there was something so inherently crazy on America ostensibly saying we can't have the Arab world have a bomb when we did everything we could to give the Israelis a bomb. Anyway, it caused me a lot of trouble. I think the New York Times, the way they wrote, what they did on my book when it came out, they wrote a big story about it. It came out on a Sunday, all over the front page. But it said, I had estimated how many bombs the Israelis had. It was all about how many bombs they had, and not much work about the whole thrust of the book, which was what America did that was crazy, to help them get the bomb.
Dans vos mémoires, vous parlez de la guerre désastreuse d'Israël contre le Hezbollah en 2006. Est-ce que votre travail est devenu plus difficile depuis?
Oh, well, but don't forget there had been a war earlier. The Americans had basically stood aside as Israel went into Lebanon much earlier. Well, what I did is I wrote a series of articles. I happen to think the biggest mistake America has made was ignoring people like Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, who once we invaded Iraq in 2003, the famous, remember the raid at night, the American bombing of Baghdad. First time we'd ever bombed an Arab country, I think, to that extent. Basically, we threw 20, 30 rockets, 40 rockets in. Anyway, I remember how shook up we all were that we actually, Bush and George Bush II and Cheney actually took the war to Iraq when Iraq had nothing to do with ISIS and 9/11. I mean, it was just very crazy to me. It remains crazy. And so at that point, the whole Arab world coalesced against us, and Nasrallah was probably the most important person involved, and just in terms of he ran what we call the terrorist group, which right now, as you know, is very, very prominent in the politics of Lebanon, even though they've had I have no idea what's going on. There was a shootout. There've been a major attacks yesterday. There's still a lot of tension about Hezbollah among certain, particularly some of the Catholic political groups in Lebanon. But Hezbollah is a force, and Nasrallah is a force. And I remember going to see, I saw him 5 times, I think. It was very hard to get what he said published. I was then working for the New Yorker magazine because he was seen as a terrorist, which I guess in some sense he was. He certainly was a Shia who was against the American involvement in the Middle East and Israel, and also in Lebanon. But he also was a Lebanese. He also was Lebanese and interested in his group has been working internally. They've been in the parliament. They've had executive offices. They recently, because of the crisis there, because of this terrible leadership in Lebanon, just terrible leadership for decade after decade, very much great corruption, the Hariri family, etc. And so recently there's no fuel there. The Lebanese just arranged for Iranian oil and Iranian fuel, diesel fuel, to come and be shipped. And they did they're doing things that are, that keep the dying society flickering alive. It's a very tough place right now. But what happened in 2006, the Israelis began a war against Lebanon, and they got the crap kicked out of them. That they got ambushed. The most elite units were ambushed inside across the border, and it was a debacle. And of course, they wrote about it as, well, it was even. We didn't win, but we didn't lose. But they lost the internal papers, and so I wrote pieces about that. I also visited Nasrallah about a month before a major election in Iraq, in which time he told me the exact numbers that would be produced from the election. In other words, the opposition to the government, that the pro-American opposition would get more than, they would get 51% and think that's enough, but it isn't, he said, because they're counting wrong. His side needs only 45, 46% to get a majority. I don't know how he figured it out. Anyway, the numbers he gave me for an election that took place 4 weeks later were within 1 point, 1/10 of a point correct. I mean, it's just amazing. I mean, there's a whole world there that we don't understand, that in the Shia Sunni world, as a Shia leader, it's just America's never understood really that division, the history. And we also have, in America, we have no idea of the tribal influences.
À l'époque, vous avez également fait une grande révélation sur la guerre en Irak. Comment est-ce que vous avez appris l'existence de la torture dans la prison d'Abou Ghraib?
We started the war in Iraq in 2003, and it was very clear to us. We didn't know who the bad guys were. We couldn't tell the bad guys from the good guys. And one of the things we did is we set up a alternative government, a temporary government in Baghdad, led by American former State Department officials and others. And we declared, we declared an end to nationalization of all of the industries. We privatized everything. We disbanded the army. So a lot of, including disbanding pay for people in the army. So the only place they could go to get paid would be to Al Qaeda and the opposition. You're a colonel, you're making $200, $300, $400 in US dollars. All of a sudden you're cut off. Well, who's got the money? Anyway, it was just amazingly dumb stuff. and the other problem was we couldn't find the enemy. We didn't know who they were. We were getting ambushed all over the place. The war wasn't going well, so we began to start arresting young men and sent them to Abu Ghraib. And many of them, they were just, the old cliche, wrong place, wrong time. and 18 to 20-year-olds, and it was an old prison that it was about. Basically in a suburb. It's a little farther away than a suburb of Baghdad. Maybe 30 clicks away, 30 kilometers away, 20 miles or so outside of town. But it was a prison that who had built it? Whether the British built it or not, I think something like that way back. We rebuilt it. It was an awful place, and we made it an American prison, and there was torture going on. People we thought were high-value suspects, and among the tortures there was one group of GIs who were in prison guards who had been trained as traffic police in a Army Reserve unit in Pennsylvania. They were suddenly sent to Iraq and made prison guards, knowing nothing about how to do it, with no supervision. And there were young women and men there, and they all began to mess around with each other. And then they began to mess around with prisoners. They would strip them naked, pile them up, and they took pictures of it. And they would pretend to masturbate. Some of the young women would pretend. In the Arab world, it's in the Quran. Modesty is very important. You don't walk around, particularly men. It's privacy and nudity is just very much a private issue. And so they began to strip bunches of men naked and parade around, and the women would pretend to, and they took photographs of it. And there was other terrible things happening too. And so this all became a scandal inside the army, and it was being suppressed. And I eventually picked up on it and wrote some pieces, and I got some more photographs and wrote some stories about it. As a journalist, I've had two things that stick in my mind always. When I began to do the My Lai story as an outsider in 1969, I worked, as I said, for the AP, and I was a freelancer. I was writing magazine pieces and pieces for the Sunday newspapers, just as a living. That, as I said, I was married with a kid, but everything was cheap. As I said, gasoline was cheap, and we could make. My wife was a social worker, and so I get into the story, and the first thing you do is, before I wrote anything, I tried to find people that were in the unit that did the killing. And I was flying around like crazy for gone all the time, and I went to city after city where I had the name of the company, people in the company. I found one kid who knew some of the people, and he gave me an address for somebody in Oregon, a small town in Oregon, a Mormon town. I found him in the middle of the night, and he gave me the address of some of his buddies. Most of the people who were involved in My Lai, which had happened 18 months earlier, they only were in the army for 2 years or so. They were drafted, and they were the lowest of the low. They were the lowest in IQ and the lowest, you know what I mean? They were sent into the field. That's anybody with much brains became a clerk or wrote reports. The kids who had less education or from poorer communities or were Afro-American or Hispanic, they ended up proportionally much more in combat, and also hated that. And so I would fly around, and one of the boys had done the worst. There was a boy named Midlo who had lived somewhere in Indiana, who had been a part. They had put 40 to 60 people, men, women, and children, into a ditch. There was a lot of random killing, but this was really design killing. They went in and they executed them, gun with machine guns, just boom, 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 just a horrible. Even amidst that carnage of going around and shooting everybody you saw, that was really an unbelievable violation of every international law there is about warfare. And this young man had not wanted to do it, but he was ordered by, his name was Paul Meadle, he was ordered by a famous man, Lieutenant Calley, who was a platoon leader, a lieutenant. And he was ordered to do it, and he did it, was weeping. And I learned about him, and he lived in a small town in Indiana. Rural Indiana, it's way south. Indiana is a middle western state. And in the south of Indiana, in the middle of the country, was a period of enormous anti-Black. Ku Klux Klan, the famous Black gangsters, famous white people who wore hoods. They were very big in that part of Indiana, close to Kentucky, and if you know the map of America, next to Illinois. A small town called New Goshen. I remember I was somewhere in the West when I learned about him, and I called. I didn't know how to reach him, but I called. I stood at a payphone and I called every phone. I found I called every operation, every the way phone systems are set up in America, there's operators. This was in 1969, and telephone directories in various districts. And I would call up the operator in each district. There may be 12 different phone districts, and I'd ask for his name. And I finally found somebody who gave me the number. The spelling was okay. I finally found him. I was on the phone for hours. I think it was a nickel then, maybe a dime. But I must have spent $20 calling phone operators. And I finally found the name, and I called, and I got an old lady answered the phone. The boy's name was Paul Meadlow in New Goshen, Indiana. He was 19 or 20 when he was at My Lai. He'd been in the Army a year and had executed everybody. And the next day, the reason it was so important, he stepped on a landmine after shooting everybody, and his foot was blown off. And while they were waiting for a helicopter to take him away, he started screaming, "God has punished me, and God will punish all of you for what we've done. God will punish," and everybody remembered that. And so I flew, I was like a madman, I guess. I ended up getting to this, it was south of a place called Indianapolis, a big city, rented a car, and I finally found that place. I found the farm, and I pulled up in this very poor farm in a very poor part of Midwestern America, 1969. And there were chicken coops there, and they were had holes in them. The chickens were running around. It was a farm. It looked like there was no man around. The boy was there. I called his mother the night before. She said, I don't know if he'll talk to you. And so when I got there, and I at that time, I used to pretend I was a grown-up. I had a suit. I put on a little suit and a tie and a jacket. I looked like I was a serious fellow, and I would get out with a briefcase and introduce myself. And this woman came out. She was 50, the mother of the boy, and she looked 70. It was obviously a hard life in this rural small town. I don't even know if they had running water there. I couldn't tell. And there were two wooden houses. And I said, "I'm the guy that called last night, the reporter, to talk to your son, Paul." His name was Paul Meadlow. And I said, "Is he here?" She says, "Well, he's in there," pointed to the other house. And then she said to me, this uneducated lady that knew nothing about much at all. She said to me, words you'll never forget as a journalist. She said to me, "I gave them a good boy, and they sent me back a murderer." How's that? Pretty amazing. And a line like that, you just, it makes you think that journalism, there's something to it. I did go talk to him, and I wrote a story, and he went on television, and that made it a national, he described killing kids. He shot child after child. He described it cold-bloodedly. "I did because I was ordered to. Did you know what was wrong? I was under orders," he said. And it shocked America. And it didn't change anything. The war went on for 4 more years. People like to think it changed. It may have changed some attitudes. But you could see the power of good journalism. And the issue you mentioned in Abu Ghraib, it was the same thing, the same story. I did that in 69. Abu Ghraib's 25 years later in 2004. 69 is 34 years later. 34 years later, I'm still a reporter. I'm working for the New Yorker then, no longer the Times, the New Yorker, which was a great magazine. And I learned about the Abu Ghraib, the torture and the pictures and the sexual abuse of prisoners. And I do a first story about it. And I ended up writing 3 stories in a row for the New Yorker. And the New Yorkers are very, very well checked. And the last person you do when you file the piece is the grammarian. There's somebody with the Oxford OED, the great Oxford Dictionary. And it's all about, there's a lot of worry about what they call parallelism in sentence structure, and I'm not talking about verbs matching, verb tense, but it's parallelism in structure. And so we have to go through that. It's a very well done, closely edited magazine. And there are 3 pieces in a row, each of about 10, 12,000 words. It's like we were going like nuts. But after the first piece, I did a radio interview on public radio. And somebody said, "Well, how do you get your information?" I said, "You just do it. Right now, there's a lot of people listening to this show. And I'll tell you, if you got something to say to me, here's my phone number." And I gave him my office phone number. I don't think we have cell phones. Yeah, we had cell phones. I gave him my cell phone number. And sure enough, later that day, a woman calls. Her daughter had been in the unit that did the dirty stuff, the sex stuff. And before she went to the unit, they were a small town in Pennsylvania. They were an Army Reserve unit. They were called up to active duty And they were, as I said, they were trained to be people who controlled traffic controllers, cars, when they should stop and go. And they were something, when they got to Iraq, they were told they were prison guards now. And they were thrown into a prison knowing nothing. And before she had left, her mother had given her a portable computer to use. So, when she gets bored, to play games, or do whatever, watch movies, I don't know what. It's 2004. And when she came back, the daughter was completely different. She wouldn't talk to her mother. She moved to another city. This is before she knew about what I wrote about. This is before she knew about the sex stuff. But she knew her daughter came back. She'd been in the unit at the time. She wasn't involved in anything criminal, so she wasn't charged. Although she saw everything and she knew what was going on. And she had all the pictures. And so the daughter moved, wouldn't talk, was disconsolate. And the other thing the daughter did is she began to get tattooed. And she was a blonde girl, light-skinned. And before long, she had tattooed all of her body up to the neck, all of her body, with black tattoos. And it was as if she wanted to change her skin, the color. You know what I mean? It was her way of coping with what she saw. And at some point, the mother went to the computer that the daughter had returned her and found a file marked Abu Ghraib, and opened it up. There were 2,000 photographs, the worst you've ever seen, and called me. She remembered I'd left that phone number and she'd written it down. And I went, it took me about a day. I finally convinced her, and she gave me the photographs, and we published a bunch of them. If you remember this, the most iconic one were two shepherds. There was a naked soldier like that with all of his loins and everything exposed. And the two dogs are being held an inch away from his groin by handlers. Unbelievable stuff that we were doing. And so again, the idea that a mother said it was as if she wanted to change her skin to escape from what she had been part of. And so, I don't think there's anything more dramatic than journalism. I feel very rewarded. I'm glad I went to law school after college and I hated it. I'm glad I did. I couldn't stand it. I'm just happy. I didn't know I'd be a journalist. The only thing I knew is I like to read.
Vous commencez vos mémoires en écrivant que vous êtes un survivant de l'âge d'or du journalisme. Qu'est-ce que représentait cet âge d'or pour vous et qu'est-ce qui a changé aujourd'hui?
I think the worst thing that's happened to American reporting has been cable news, 24-hour news, insatiable news. And the way it works, when I was a reporter at the New York Times and at the New Yorker, when I did most of my good work in the 70s, 1970s, 80s, 90s, and even in the 2010, until I've been quiet for I did a book. Anyway, I've been quiet for years. But it was before the advent, the work I did on the war in Afghanistan and all the other stuff, My Lai and all that, was done before you had cable news. And when I was at the New York Times, I had a lot of stories that were, I just mentioned Watergate. I did a lot of stories on the CIA. And the idea that you would do a story for, a major story all over the newspapers, domestic spying, and then NBC would call up and they'd say, we'd like to talk to Mr. Hersh about his story. And I would say to the public relations people at the New Yorker or at the New York Times, well, go read it. What do I have to talk about something that's in the newspaper? That was my attitude. I don't want to go on television and talk about a story I wrote. It's there. I wrote it. So I would rarely go. And then later there was some morning shows. And every once in a while I'd be asked to go for the New Yorker because it's good for business to go on Good Morning, the Today Show or something like that. And I do that about a story. But mostly I stayed out of it. And then to discover that the business now is, the way it works now, and by the way, when I was writing, even on the deadline for a newspaper, if I write a story and it was a running story and I would be doing it day after day, to keep it going, I could file as late as 7 o'clock, 7:30 for the first edition. So I worked all day. Now the whole idea is, since the newspaper business is dying, subscriptions are dying, home delivery dying, it's going to eventually be on air like you are going to be. It's all going to be on air. I don't know what's happening with the major newspapers, but I'm sure Le Monde and other good papers don't have the circulation they did. don't have the money they did. And so on air. And so part of the way of getting people to buy instead of paying, $100 a month for the paper to be delivered at home, you can pay $15 a month and get it online, or $12 a month, something like that. That's what the New York Times and Washington Post do now, more of their clients that way. And so to do that, you have to feed cable television. So reporters, they have a story, and by the middle of the day, they have to file a summary of the story. And then they have to go internally and do a broadcast that's going to be given to MSNBC, the cable company, CNN. And then they have to go at night, or they have a studio even in the newsroom where they interviewed that night on CNN. If they do MSNBC 1 hour, CNN the next hour, another different one, you know what I mean? They're actually, if you will, pimping, because they have to be, part of their job is to sell themselves and sell the newspapers. So it's a totally different atmosphere, and it leads to a lot of bad reporting. It leads to a lot of reporters wanting to be on page one, wanting to get a big story. They want to get on television that night. Why? Because they can maybe get a contract. Many of them have contracts for more money than they make at the newspaper, to commit it to one of the cable companies. And the cable companies also hire even former heads of the CIA to go on and tell their lies. And so you're dealing with a news world that's driven by immediacy, stories that should be carefully reported should be taken as tips are run into the air, run right on air, right away. There's no thinking, you just do it right away. There was I remember being horrified. There was a very good reporter at the New York Times that learned about during the campaign, Hillary versus Trump, that she was using a government computer to have a secret back channel Gmail, and doing business Gmail, and who knows what she was doing on it. She was a very powerful Secretary of State, and he learned about it, and he made a few calls and learned it was so, and then immediately ran on the air and told it. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, no, spend 2 months and find out what was being said, what she was doing, because then you're just giving her all the time in the world to get rid of anything she wants. You know what I mean? You have to be more, and it's just not as good. It just can't be as good. Reporters, when they get something, they go, and look, Trump is what Trump is, but the cable companies are still doing Trump every day. They don't do the news because they've got an audience of Democrats who are terrified of Trump, and I must say the media. Look, Trump is Trump. He beat every Republican. He beat a famous Republican family. He beat the Bush family. Are you kidding me? He beat everybody in the primaries. It was very hard not to take him seriously. They did not, and for a lot of good reasons. He was always a threat. Hillary ran a terrible campaign. I think I've said what I've said from the very beginning. I know a lot of people in the community. I've been around a long time. And as far as I know, there's never been any information inside that the Russians interfered in that election. Why would he? What does Putin care about America? Putin's much more powerful now than America. Everybody's looking at China, and I'm so happy about it. China has one foreign base. Do you know how many America has? 800. We have 800 bases overseas. China has one. If you add up the French and British and European bases, it's about 22 or 23. And China has one. I mean, come on. I mean, who's making the most trouble in the world? We have 800. And we spend an unbelievable amount of money. We think arms all the time. And you wonder why we had such a disaster getting out of Afghanistan. Well, I mean, the same army that couldn't win the war in 20 years is suddenly going to be responsible for what they call the exfiltration, the orderly process of people we want to get out of Kabul before the Taliban take over, or as they do. I mean, if you let the army do it, you're going to have the chaos. One of my friends said to me, what we should have done is hired the guys who are responsible for crowd control at big rock concerts. They would have done a much better job controlling the crowd, getting people out, than the U.S. Army, because it demonstrated in 20 years it's simply not capable of doing a lot of things it should be capable of doing for reasons that are complicated.
Dans la mesure où l'économie chinoise se développe de plus en plus, est-ce que les États-Unis peuvent rester le gendarme du monde?
At this point, I hear what you're saying. I hear that fear. At this point, well, China's economy went up something like 11% in the last year, and it's, you know, they've got it. You know, as somebody wrote, a wonderful journalist, Anatole Levine, that we're worried sick about there's 3 or 4 little islands in which China want to build things, low-lying islands off Viêt Nam, and there's a lot of debate about what we're doing. And meanwhile, in 5 years, if we don't do something about climate control, they'll all be underwater. What's the worry about them? And so we have a lot more serious problems right now. Climate control, the Chinese, there was a story in the paper just yesterday that I was reading. They had a flood in the north, in a region in northern China where there's a lot of industry. 60 coal mines were put out of business. China has so much polluting it does, and this it seems to me that's our biggest issue with China should be to make some unilateral steps we should make unilaterally on our own to curb, to cut back in industries that create too much of the toxic air, and force China to begin to start doing something about the coal process. The problem is China is now going to be doing an immense amount of expansion in Central Asia, I think right now, and that's going to be that's going to take a lot of energy and a lot of coal and a lot of pollution. And so we really have to do something about that, I think. That's really important. And so I don't worry about in the short run about China. They have so many other problems. I'm awfully happy to see America be diminished, because it seems to be our role in the world in terms of spreading democracy has been a complete failure.
Vous avez dit que le travail d'un journaliste est de rechercher la vérité et non de faire part des polémiques. Pour vous, les 2 mots les plus mortels dans le monde des médias sont « je pense ». Est-ce que vous pouvez nous décrire ce qu'est pour vous le vrai journalisme?
The issue was it's all immediate. There's no thought. There's, oh, this is going on. There's in my idea of being a good reporter, if there's a controversy between 2 sides, yes, you can write a story about the controversy, but you should first try and find out who may be right. It's your job to try and find out something. You're not just a parrot. You should just be parroting what they filed in court, but you should do some effort. And so it's all on face value. Everything's just done. It's right now, cable TV in America is totally divided between people who hate Trump and people who love Trump. So you have two networks, CNN and MSNBC, who hate Trump, and Fox News that loves Trump. There's no middle ground. There's no way for any group on one side to trust anything anybody else said. It's like I mentioned, when I joined the New York Times in 1972, it was so neutral about the war. I mean, it had wonderful correspondents in Viêt Nam, Charlie Moore, Dave Halberstam, etc., Neil Sheehan. But from Washington, it was very neutral, to the point where they were almost pro-war, because they weren't really getting objective about what was going on, how bad it was. But at least it was a standard bearer. And now you don't have any media that's objective. They're still talking about Trump every day. And my problem, look, who liked Trump? I like the idea that Trump, he frightened me too, but I like what he said about NATO being useless, which I think is, are you kidding? How long has it been useless? I learned 20 years, half the jobs aren't even filled. And there's a billet after billet. And they celebrate the holiday of all their countries. So they have about 40 weekends. You can take weekends off like crazy, 30 weekends a year, because they celebrate the holidays. It's just the most useless place, and very much rabid anti-communism. Irrational and not very smart. And so, and he also wanted to talk to the North Koreans, and right away, it didn't matter what he did. He was attacked. He was attacked bitterly, and so there was. Look, he brought us some problems on. I have no use for him, but the instinctive thing was that whatever he did was, he said I'll go to Tehran, probably if there was a good enough hotel for him. But for as bad as he was, at least there was some things he was saying that you could maybe hope he would do. None of it happened. But the media never really, they just attacked him. It was polarized from the beginning. Maybe it should be. Maybe it was the right thing to do. But I thought I thought there should have been a little more thought. You know, going to North Korea and talking was very innovative for me, and I liked the fact that he went to see Putin, and he wasn't that afraid. But he learned the only way to deal is to say Putin's a bad guy and go on with life. You know, that's the way it is. I'm one of those to think Russia's going to be a force for a long time, and the Chinese are going to be a force for a long time, and we're going to be a force for a long time. I don't know what our fear is. They're not coming here. China doesn't, you know, we're still a very powerful country.
Aujourd'hui, à la télévision, il y a de la place que pour les opinions, pas pour les faits. Est-ce que vous pensez que finalement les journalistes ont encore leur place à la télévision?
If you go on cable television these days, they have panels. And all of CNN, they all have panels. And now we'll have our panel, and they introduce three people, one of whom may have worked in the government, one of whom may be a journalist for a newspaper, one of whom may be a political scientist. And these panelists all discuss the day's events, and they begin every sentence invariably, not always, but almost every sentence with, I think, because they're bringing on people who know nothing. Because, you know, the people who know nothing won't go on those shows. People who know something, why would you go on a show and shoot your mouth off? It would just be crazy to. So it's all a reduction in intelligence. And so the cable television is a reductor, it's a reducer. And it's very bad for journalism. It's been terrible. On the other hand, the New York Times is getting, you know, many million more subscribers online as they lose subscribers. But if you still look at the newspaper almost every day, most of the ads are what they call house ads. There was one just yesterday in the paper that really amused me. It said, support the New York Times, buy products that we sell. And then there was a picture of a coffee mug. And the New York Times sells T-shirts. And the ad said, just support your local New York Times, buy one of our products. They were getting down to that. And then the New York Times offers, they do trips, foreign trips. They have a reporter take a group of people on a trip that you can buy into. And they have summer schools, and they do anything to make money. They're just desperate. And so we're in a real crisis in the media, because the media, the form that exists today, I think we'll probably end up with maybe one or two newspapers, national newspapers, the New York Times and maybe the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal at the most. And none of them have the same space they used to. They have staffs, but so many of the good reporters move on. I see that more and more, and we're left with the less good. But anyway, but that's, you know, so we have to pay more attention to books, more attention to your kind of stuff, podcasts. That's why they're so big, and other stuff. We just have to find other ways to get the kind of information we want. And the new generation is much more adept than my crowd. I mean, I have three children. They have extended conversations about the podcast they've been listening to. I have no idea what they're talking about. So it's a different world, and it'll cope. But it's a changed world, and I don't like it. That's all I'm saying.
Qu'est-ce que vous aviez dans les années 70 et que vous ne pourriez plus avoir aujourd'hui? Est-ce que vous pensez que vous arriveriez à faire aujourd'hui la même chose que ce que vous aviez fait dans le passé?
No. If I'd been working for the New York Times, I doubt if I could have got the My Lai story published. I would have had to have something more. You know, I don't know, maybe a photograph of somebody raping somebody. I don't know what. No, I don't think so. I don't think I had freedom, and I had freedom. There was a lot of trust. It ended up with, on the stories I wrote, ended up with trust in me, and I don't see. I see that in every day in the New York Times, there's 3 or 4 people writing stories. They're all signed. The bylines, if you notice, the bylines are, that way nobody's responsible. You know, when you have that many people writing. So I was always responsible for what I wrote. And if there were letters written complaining, I could deal with them. When you have that many people writing, it's all collective. Well, there's no money. That's the big thing. Nobody, until 2011, from My Lai on, when I worked at a newspaper for a magazine, I did what I wanted. I mean, I had ideas. I I don't think I got an assignment from an editor from 1979 until now. I picked my own subjects. And I could just fly where I wanted to. I could just say, I've got to go to Paris tonight and fly off, and nobody worried about it because they had, the New York Times was, when I joined the New York Times, the Sunday paper was 500 pages. And they used to have a cap on how much, they used to have a cap on profits. They were making so much money that they had to limit the profits. At a certain point, everything above a certain percentage went back into the paper. And so it wasn't that I was paid I wasn't given an astronomical pay. I was paid well, but I could just take off and go. I think the first day I was at the New York Times, I write about this in the memoir that you mentioned that I wrote. The first day at the New York Times, I was May 1st, 1972 in North Vietnam. I had made a big incursion. They had come down Highway 1 towards Saigon. And there was a big panic. And I was supposed to spend a week in the New York bureau. I was going to work in Washington to get acclimated to the paper. That night, the editor of the paper, his name was Abe Rosenthal, came up to me and asked, I was in Washington. I lived in Washington, but I was in New York for a week. I was first week at the New York Times, 1972. And I was supposed to get acclimated, meet the editors and all that stuff. And he came to me because there was something going on in Vietnam. And he said, do you have your passport? And he said, go home. And I said, no. Go home, get your passport, and fly to Paris and find the North Vietnamese, Le Duc Tho, and others at the delegation to the Paris peace talks and find out what's going on from their side, because we had people who could talk to, Henry Kissinger would talk to us. I was the comedy reporter, because I'd written and that night I flew business class in Air France to Paris, stayed at the Crillon, where a glass of orange juice costs more than I spent for food in days. Do you know what I mean? That was the New York Times of 1972. Staying at the Crillon and just doing what I wanted, going where I wanted. And there was a total trust that I wouldn't abuse it, which of course I wouldn't, but you could just, I had air travel cards and credit cards, and it just doesn't happen like that anymore. It's much more difficult. It was just a sense that the only thing I could do was write for the paper. I had no interest in being on television, no interest in talking to anybody else. I just worked for the newspaper. I didn't have to worry about going on cable TV and saying what I thought about something. And the only time I went on television, sometimes I would go on a Sunday show or Meet the Press or something when there was somebody to be interrogated. And usually I didn't last long on that either because I asked too many hard questions.
Vous qui fréquentez les écoles de journalisme, qu'est-ce que vous pensez des nouveaux journalistes?
Here you are. You just got done hearing me say the trouble with cable television is people go on and their first two words are, I think. So now you're asking me what I think about something. What difference is it what I think? Here's what I think. Here's what I know. You can't read. You can't write without reading. And I worry about some of the new reporters who don't do enough homework. I worry about the idiotic things that are written about the Middle East. I worry about the people that have no memory of history. I worry about the people that weren't troubled, like most Americans, were not troubled by the American and British day and night bombing of cities in Germany in World War II. There are military people I know, high-ranking military people who consider that to be one of the great war crimes ever. The number of innocent German people we killed, non-combatants, was enormous. And I worry about people that don't appreciate that idea, that non-combatants are non-combatants. We sometimes say in Vietnam in the early days when the war was over, 58,000 American boys were killed and between 1 and 2 million Vietnamese, as if there wasn't much difference between 1 and 2 million. So it's not a question of what we think, it's a question of what we know and what we learn. And a lot of the reporters today seem to me to not have that much background. But, that's just, I'm an old man talking about young men. And that's always a dangerous thing. I had to go into the Army as a kid. It was compulsory. And I always think it was a good thing. I learned a few things in the Army, a lot. I learned to hate officers because I was just an enlisted man. But I learned something about the Army. I learned something interesting about the Army, just about how they work. I would never have been able to find Lieutenant Kelly when he was hidden at a base if I didn't know how the Army organized itself in terms of personnel. There's always somebody listed somewhere.
Le journaliste américain Isidore Feinstein a écrit que tous les gouvernements mentent. Est-ce que vous pensez que le journalisme devrait essayer de mettre encore plus de moyens pour découvrir les mensonges des gouvernements?
Well, I did know Iostone very well. I mean, he and I became friends, and our families became friends. He had a lovely wife, and he loved Japanese food. We used to have a lot of meals, and he was a man of the world, which is hard to believe because he was such a anti-war person. But he did it on the basis of doing homework. He outworked everybody, and I was a hard worker. He made me look like a babe, and of course the governments lie. I mean, why wouldn't they lie if they're elected by the people? And then you have the fascists who control by lies. So of course they lie. Presidents lie. And worse than that, most people don't tell presidents what they should tell presidents because it makes it awkward for them. So you have the whole it's all sort of a lack of communication. I worked for a man running for president once, Eugene McCarthy, and I'll tell you, the hardest thing to do is to tell him something he didn't want to hear. It's just hard to do it. You know, people that are, he was running a campaign against the war, which made me very happy. But it was really tense to me if I wanted to tell him, he wanted to have a day off, and I would say to him, no, I've already scheduled. So, and I would just not tell him the truth sometimes. But that's just the way it is. Public life is, people don't want to tell the truth to powerful people. I think the president's often the last person to know what's really going on. He thinks he does, but he doesn't.
Vous espériez qu'Internet soit un progrès pour le journalisme. Pourquoi, selon vous, seuls quelques rares sites web ont réussi?
The Internet has some amazing things in it. There's no reason to go interview somebody, and I still find it, and have them say, now, where were you born? And how old are you, and where did you work? Because the Internet is amazing. You can find almost anything you need. And it's an amazing research tool, and it's pretty dependable. I like obituaries. I get a lot out of them because, frankly, I don't know what happens in the French papers, but the New York Times in particular, some of the best stories in the paper are obituaries. More complicated, sometimes they're not very good, but a lot of times they're full of information. So no, the Internet's it's a godsend, and it's being used. I think it helps a lot. On the other hand, the whole notion of a story that's trending, that idea of a story trending, that's very dangerous. Because if you're a reporter and you want to make it, you want to find stories that are trending, which means that sometimes the story isn't good enough, you make it better. Or you hype it, or you run it 2 days before it's ready, because you're worried about not being scooped. I always never worried about somebody scooping me, only because, that could happen. So what? So you don't lose a story. Every once in a while you lose a story, but it's much better to keep on working on a story as much as you can.
Seymour Hersh, merci. Nous sommes arrivés à la fin de cette interview. Je vous pose notre question traditionnelle. Qu'est-ce qui, selon vous, est connu de peu de personnes et qui mériterait d'être connu de tous?
I'll tell you what. In another planet, in another solar system, we'll have a long talk about that. That's a question that is almost unanswerable. I mean, in your field, what's not known is not known. So, the unknowns, I think Rumsfeld said is there's unknowns, and then there's known unknowns, something like that. What's generally not known or not anticipated are consequences. And I'll give you the classic one. Daniel Ellsberg, who's an old friend of mine who did the Pentagon Papers, who was, as you know, actually a brilliant scholar too. He got his doctorate in political theory and economic theory. He was an economist too when he was 25 from Harvard. He once said to me, the one question he was always asked when he was high up in the government, they were planning bombing attacks in Viêt Nam. And he was a consultant back in the 60s. And he's a very interesting guy, very high, as I said, brilliant. He would ask sometimes the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the men who do the bombing, the planning, the gross planning, not the specific planning, the lay out a campaign. Well, how many people do you think will die because of this bombing that are not, non-combatants? And they never had an answer to that question. So the question I would always ask before we plan anything is, what are going to be, how many human beings will die because of this? That's a question we almost never ask when we begin an operation. And that's the question that should be asked always, but it isn't.